In this lecture, we're going to get a basic understanding of how Vue implements reactivity with our data. This information can be useful if you're ever in an interview. You'll be able to explain Vue's reactivity better compared to other candidates. From what we understand so far, reactivity is when a program is able to react to changes. One famous example is Excel. Excel is a spreadsheet program. One of the more useful features of Excel is it's able to calculate results on the fly. I have Excel opened on my machine to give an example. I'm going to write two numbers in a single column. If I want to get the sum of both numbers, I can highlight the two cells. Then, I'll right-click to bring up the menu. I'll select Quick Analysis. This option will bring up a list of calculations we can perform on the two values. Under the Totals option, I'll select Sum. The sum will be outputted below the other two cells. I can freely update any of the two cells. The third cell will be reflected with the changes. Excel is able to react to changes on the fly. Vue replicates this behavior with our app. Whenever our data changes, the document will be updated to reflect the changes. Under the hood, Vue is using something called Proxies. I've mentioned Proxies a few times already, but how exactly do Proxies work? Let's dive into Proxies. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to CodePen. CodePen is a playground for quickly prototyping projects in the browser. We're going to be using it quickly to look at how Proxies work. We don't need to set up a new project for this demonstration. Let's create a new pen. We don't need CSS for this example. It's safe to minimize this section. We're also going to open the console to help us with debugging. In the JavaScript section, we're going to create an object called data. You can imagine this object the same as the object we would return from the data function. We'll add one property to this object called name. The object we created is very plain. We can directly access its properties and update them too. In a complex app, we'll most likely want to observe this object. When I say observe, I mean watch for changes or how it's accessed. By becoming aware of how the object is treated in our app, we can perform additional actions. At the moment, we can't observe the object. We don't know when it's accessed or if the values have been changed. One way to force our app to observe the object is by using proxies. Below this object, let's create a new variable called observed data. Its value will be a new instance of the proxy object. The proxy object was introduced to address the exact problem we're facing. It allows us to observe an object. A proxy can be created by creating a new instance out of this object. It has two arguments. The first argument is the object that should be observed. We'll pass in the data object. The second argument is another object. We'll pass in an empty object. We'll talk about this object in a moment. The new instance that's returned is a copy of the object we passed into the first argument. We can treat the observed data object as if it were the data object. For example, let's log the observed data.name property. In the console, the name property was logged. The observed data object is the same object we had previously. The main difference is that we can add additional functions to it that will be called based on how the object is being interacted with. We can define functions in the object we passed into the second argument. The first function we'll look at is called set. The set function will be called whenever any of the object's properties are about to be updated. This function is called before the update occurs. There are three arguments we can accept in the function called target, key, and value. The target argument references the object we're accessing. You can think of it as the equivalent to the this keyword. The key argument is the name of the property that's being accessed. The value argument represents the value that the property will be set to. By defining this function, the property will never be updated. The reason it won't get updated is because the set function will be responsible for updating the property. If it didn't exist, the default behavior would occur. In our set function, we can have the default behavior back by setting target to the value. As you can imagine, this gives us a lot of power. The set function will always be called for any of the properties on the object when they're updated. We can use this opportunity to perform additional actions. For example, let's try updating the document with the new value. In the HTML section, we'll add a div tag with the ID of name. Next, back in the set function, we'll select the div element with the document.querySelector function. We'll update the inner text property to the value argument on the element selection. Lastly, let's update the name property. The set function won't be called until we update one of the properties on the object. We only have one property, which is the name. We'll update the name property on the observed data object to a different value. On the preview, we'll be able to see that the name gets outputted after changing the property. The great thing about this proxy is that the document will always reflect the latest value no matter how many times we update the name. It'll always output the most recent change. By using proxies, we can create our own reactive JavaScript framework. Luckily, we don't have to. Vue comes with Reactivity out of the box. It even introduces edge cases that we haven't even accounted for in our example. We don't need to recreate the wheel. Behind the scenes, Vue is using the proxy object to help it keep track of changes to our data. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the proxy object documentation page. We aren't limited to watching for changes. We can watch for when the object has been accessed or if any of its properties have been deleted. Feel free to read up on this object. This information can be handy if you're ever in an interview and want to stand out from the other candidates. Understanding how reactivity works can really set you apart.